I've covered some of the most twisted cases in true crime, but this one is pure horror. The kind of nightmare you'd expect from a gruesome thriller, except it's real. It all starts in a quiet town in New South Wales, Australia. Aberdeen, a place known for its meat industry, a town where slaughterhouses are as common as grocery stores. The people who live here are accustomed to blood, to the sight of carcasses being processed, to the hum of machinery slicing through flesh. But in the year 2000, one house in Aberdeen would become something far more sinister than a slaughterhouse. It would become the scene of one of the most grotesque murders in Australian history. It began with a disturbing silence. John Price, a well-known and well-liked man, hadn't shown up to work. He was reliable, the kind of guy who wouldn't just disappear. When his co-workers realized he was missing, they grew worried. Something felt wrong. They called the police. By the time officers arrived at his home, the early morning light was just creeping over Aberdeen. The house was still quiet, too quiet, but something lingered in the air, something foul, something unnatural. The front door was locked. Police knocked. No answer. They forced their way inside, stepping cautiously over the threshold. And then the smell hit them. At first, it was just the scent of cooked meat. But underneath, it was something rotten, something sickening. They moved through the house, searching for signs of life. Then they stepped into the kitchen. And there, on the stove, was a large pot, still warm to the touch. Inside was a human head, slowly boiling in liquid. It was John Price. The horror didn't stop there. In the living room, something hung from a metal hook, a body but without skin. It wasn't until officers looked closer that they realized this was John Price's body, skinned like an animal, peeled from head to toe. The nightmare had only begun. But who was responsible for this unthinkable crime? Her name was Katherine Knight, a woman with a history of rage, violence, and disturbing obsessions. By trade, she was a butcher. By nature, she was a predator in disguise. She wasn't just dangerous, she was explosive, unpredictable, a ticking time bomb, always waiting for an excuse to detonate. But she hadn't always been a killer. Her past relationships were filled with warning signs, each one more terrifying than the last. There was David Kellett, her first husband, a truck driver, a rough man himself, but even he couldn't control Catherine's outbursts. On their wedding night, she tried to strangle him to death because he fell asleep too soon after sex. He woke up gasping for air, prying her hands from his throat. But he stayed. Then came John Chillingworth, another partner. Catherine had a child with him, but their relationship ended when she smashed his face with a frying pan. And then there was David Saunders. This time, the violence escalated. Catherine didn't just attack him, she threatened his life constantly. One night, after a heated argument, she slit the throat of his puppy right in front of him just to prove how serious she was. And yet, she walked free. No one could control her. No one dared to. Then she met John Price. And John? He was doomed from the moment she laid eyes on him. Friends warned him. People knew what Catherine was capable of. They saw the bruises she left, the scars she carved into her partners. But John didn't run. He should have. Because Katherine Knight was more than just an abusive partner. She was something much worse. And John Price was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. Katherine Knight's story starts long before John Price. Before she became a killer, before the bloodshed, she was just a child growing up in a home filled with terror. Her father, Ken Knight, was a violent alcoholic, a man whose rage was as constant as the air in the house. He didn't just drink, he became a monster when he did. He would beat his wife in front of their children, his fists landing like thunderclaps in the dead of night. Catherine's mother, Barbara, was no stranger to pain. She endured the beatings, the insults, the cruelty until she simply accepted them. And that's what Catherine saw: a woman who stayed, a woman who endured. But what she didn't see was love. Pain and power were the only things that made sense to her. From an early age, Catherine was unpredictable, volatile, prone to fits of violent rage. At school, she was a bully, a fighter, a girl no one wanted to cross. But there was something else, something even darker lurking beneath the surface. She claimed that her mother taught her how to handle men. According to Catherine, Barbara once told her, "If your man cheats on you, the only way to keep him in line is to put him in his place. Don't be afraid to hurt him." And Catherine, she took that lesson to heart. By her teenage years, she was already feared. Her classmates knew to keep their distance. She didn't just fight, she enjoyed it. But academics, that didn't interest her. She left school at 15, barely able to read or write. She didn't need books. What she needed was control. And she would find that control in blood, steel, and slaughter. Some people fear the sight of blood. Some turn away when they see an animal cut open, its insides spilling out. Katherine Knight. She loved it. When she landed her first job at a local slaughterhouse, it was like she had found her calling. The smell of raw meat, the metallic tang of blood, the precision of the knives cutting through flesh, it excited her. She wasn't just good at her job, she was unnatural. The knives felt right in her hands. Her co-workers noticed something off about her. She didn't just work in the slaughterhouse, she lived for it. When the day ended, she took her knives home with her. And she didn't put them in a drawer. Instead, she hung them on the wall above her bed. Not in a toolbox, not in a kitchen drawer. Above her bed. "Just in case I need them," she would say with a smirk. Coworkers whispered about her. They saw the way she looked at them when she was angry, like they were animals, like they were something she could cut open just as easily as a carcass on the slaughterhouse floor. No one challenged her. No one dared. Because Katherine Knight wasn't just fascinated by knives. She was obsessed with them. And soon, her obsession would become something far more terrifying. John Price had been warned. His friends, his co-workers, even his exes, everyone knew who Katherine Knight was. They had heard the stories, seen the bruises she left behind, watched the men in her past disappear with haunted looks in their eyes. But John, he thought he could handle her. John Price was a good man, a hard-working miner, respected in his community, the kind of guy who never missed a day of work. He had kids from a previous relationship, a home, a stable life. And when he met Katherine Knight in the mid-1990s, it seemed like a new beginning. At first, everything was perfect. Katherine could be charming, fun, even affectionate. She cooked him elaborate meals, laughed at his jokes, made him feel like he had finally found someone who truly cared for him. But underneath the sweet exterior, something was bubbling, and soon it would boil over. The fights began. At first, they were small accusations, jealous comments, minor outbursts. Then it escalated. Catherine was possessive, suffocating, violent. She would fly into uncontrollable rages over the smallest things. If John came home a little late, accusations of cheating. If he didn't answer the phone fast enough, screaming threats. Then came the physical attacks. She scratched him, hit him, threw objects at him. Sometimes she used her knives, leaving deep scars on his body and even deeper ones on his mind. John didn't want to admit it, but he was afraid. He wanted out, and he tried. But Katherine Knight wasn't the kind of woman you just leave, because leaving her came with a price, and John Price was about to pay it. John had finally had enough. One night, after yet another violent outburst, he kicked Catherine out of his house. It should have been the end. It wasn't, because Catherine didn't just let people walk away from her. If she couldn't have you, she would destroy you. And for John, she knew exactly where to hit him where it hurt the most: his job. John Price had spent years working as a miner. It was his livelihood, his identity, his security. Catherine knew that, so she made sure he lost it. She went to his employer, spinning a vicious lie. She told them that John was stealing from the company, that he had been smuggling out equipment, pocketing things that weren't his. It was a complete fabrication. But in a small town like Aberdeen, rumors spread fast. And even though his boss knew he was a good worker, the accusation was enough. John Price lost his job, and Katherine Knight smiled. She had taken away his income, his stability, his pride. But she wasn't done yet, because ruining his career wasn't enough. No, she wanted John Price to suffer in every possible way. And the next time she stepped foot inside his house, she would make sure he never walked out alive. John Price was a dead man walking. He knew it. His friends knew it. But somehow he still stayed. After everything Catherine had done, after the violence, the threats, the lies that cost him his job, he let her back into his life. Maybe he thought she would change. Maybe he thought he could handle her. But his friends weren't convinced. They saw the way she watched him, her eyes dark, calculating like a predator studying its prey. They heard the things she said, the way she talked about him, as if he was already dead. And John, he saw it too. The fear was written all over his face, the weight of something he couldn't shake. And one night, sitting among his coworkers, he finally said it out loud. "If I don't come to work tomorrow, it's because she killed me." The room went silent. He laughed it off, but no one else did, because they all knew he wasn't joking. That was the last thing he ever said to them. February 29th, 2000. The air in Aberdeen was cool and still, the streets empty, the town asleep. Inside John Price's house, the lights were off. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, the slow, steady ticking of the clock on the wall. John was in bed, fast asleep. And outside, in the dark, Katherine Knight was watching. She had let herself in, stepping silently through the house. She still had a key. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette barely visible in the dim glow from the hallway. Her breathing was steady. Her grip tightened around the knife in her hand, and then she waited. She watched him sleep, her eyes never leaving his face. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, maybe longer. Then, finally, she moved. She climbed into bed beside him. And John, he didn't wake up. Not yet. Not until it was too late. Catherine raised the knife, the blade catching the faintest glint of moonlight through the window. And then she struck. The first stab was what woke him. A deep, searing pain in his chest like fire tearing through flesh. John Price's eyes snapped open, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. He gasped, choking on blood, his vision blurring in the darkness. And then another stab, and another. Catherine was on top of him, the blade flashing in the dim light. 37 times. She plunged the knife into him over and over again with the strength of a woman who had spent years working in slaughterhouses, cutting through bone, muscle, tendons. John fought back, his hands grabbing at her, trying to stop the onslaught. But Catherine wasn't stopping. She stabbed him in the stomach, in the back, in the chest, slicing through arteries, muscle, organs. Somehow, he managed to get out of bed. He staggered down the hallway, blood spilling in thick, dark pools behind him. He reached the front door, his hand fumbling for the handle, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He almost made it. But then Katherine caught him. She dragged him back inside. The fight didn't last much longer. By the time she was done, John Price was unrecognizable. A man who had spent his whole life working hard, raising his kids, trying to be a good person, now a lifeless body, butchered in his own home. But Katherine wasn't finished yet, not even close. Most killers stop when their victims take their last breath. Katherine Knight wasn't like most killers. She knew exactly what she wanted to do next, and it was something no serial killer, no murderer, no monster in Australian history had ever done before. With the precision of a trained butcher, she took her knife and began the process of skinning John's body. Piece by piece, layer by layer. She peeled his flesh away in one continuous piece, carefully working around the muscles, the joints, the delicate sections of his body that she had once kissed, once touched, once held. Now they were nothing but meat to her. She wasn't in a rush. She took her time, working with the same methodical expertise she had used for years in the slaughterhouse. And when she was done, she hung his skin on a meat hook in the living room. A perfect replica of the man he once was, draped like a twisted piece of art. This wasn't rage anymore. This wasn't just a crime. This was something far worse. Katherine Knight wasn't just a murderer. She was a monster. And the nightmare, it was only just beginning. She wasn't done. Not even close. Most people would panic after committing a murder this brutal. They would try to cover their tracks, run, hide. But Katherine Knight, she walked into the kitchen like she was preparing a Sunday roast. The smell of copper and blood still clung to the walls, thick in the air. The house was silent except for the occasional sound of liquid *** dripping onto the floor. John's blood still pooling beneath his skinned body. Katherine didn't flinch. She grabbed her butcher's knives, the same ones she had used for years to cut through animal carcasses. But this time, her work was different. This time, she was butchering a man she once claimed to love. She worked methodically, cutting away parts of John's body, slicing muscle from bone, carving the best pieces of flesh, as if she was preparing a meal for a banquet. And then she took his head, the face that once smiled at his children, the face that once belonged to a man who had lived, worked, and loved. She dropped it into a pot of boiling water. The bubbles rose to the surface, the flesh softening, breaking down, the bones rattling against the metal pot. The scent of cooking meat filled the house. But Katherine wasn't just boiling his head. She was cooking his body. She tossed chunks of his flesh into a pan, adding potatoes, pumpkin, cabbage, stirring them together like she had done countless times before. She was making dinner. But this wasn't just any meal. This was something far more disturbing. When she was done cooking, she took 2 plates from the cupboard. She carefully arranged the food, plating it as if she was serving a gourmet dish, chunks of John Price's flesh, surrounded by vegetables, glistening with sauce. Then she went to the kitchen counter, took out 2 small pieces of paper, and wrote down 2 names. Not her own, not John's, his children. She placed the names in front of the plates, like dinner place cards at a family gathering. She was going to serve them their own father. She wanted them to eat him, to unknowingly consume the man who had raised them, loved them, protected them. It was the ultimate act of cruelty, the final way to destroy John Price even in death. She set the table, stood back to admire her work, and then she waited. Because in her mind, this wasn't murder. This was a masterpiece. The call came in early, just after dawn. John Price hadn't shown up to work. His coworkers knew something was wrong, very wrong. By now, they had heard the warnings. John himself had said it. If I don't come to work tomorrow, it's because she killed me. And now, he was missing. The police were dispatched to his house. From the outside, everything looked normal. The house was quiet, the morning sun casting long shadows across the lawn. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no screaming. But the second the officers stepped inside, the horror hit them. The smell was the first thing. Not just the stench of death and blood, but something else, something foul, greasy, thick in the air. It smelled like cooked meat, but it wasn't beef. It wasn't pork. And as they moved deeper into the house, the full nightmare unfolded. Blood was everywhere. It streaked across the floors, smeared on the walls, pooling in dark, congealed puddles. And then the living room. They stopped, their breath caught in their throats. Because there, hanging from a meat hook attached to a doorway, was John Price's skinned body. It didn't even look human. The officers could barely process what they were seeing. The body was intact, but without skin, like something out of a butcher shop, something that should not exist in a home. They turned the corner into the kitchen. And there, on the stove, a pot still simmering. One of the officers, his hands shaking, lifted the lid. Inside, John Price's head. His eyes were gone, his skin peeling away from the boiling liquid, his face mutilated beyond recognition. One officer ran outside, vomiting. Another one stood frozen, his body trembling. Because this wasn't just a crime scene. This was a horror beyond comprehension. And then they saw the table. At first glance, the table looked like something out of a family dinner. Plates were carefully arranged, silverware placed neatly beside them. The meal. Chunks of John Price's flesh, boiled vegetables, thick brown sauce. And in front of each plate, a name. John's children. The officers could barely wrap their minds around it. This wasn't just a killing. It was something far worse. And then they found the note. A single handwritten letter scrawled in uneven, shaky letters resting near the plates. They picked it up. Read it. It was incoherent, a mess of rants, accusations, and twisted justifications. In it, Katherine accused John of being an abuser, of ruining her life, of betraying her. She painted herself as the victim, as if butchering him, skinning him, and cooking him was somehow justified. It was the final, desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. But it didn't matter, because no amount of lies or twisted logic could change the truth. Katherine Knight had done something so depraved, so unspeakable, so monstrous that even the most hardened officers could barely process what they were seeing. And the worst part, she was still inside the house. After witnessing the sheer horror inside John Price's home, officers moved through the house carefully, their weapons drawn. Somewhere inside, Katherine Knight was still there. They found her in the bedroom, lying on the bed, her body motionless. Beside her, a pile of empty pill bottles. For a brief moment, the officers thought she was dead. But then they saw her chest rise. She was alive. Katherine had taken a lethal dose of pills, attempting to end her own life before anyone could hold her accountable. But she hadn't taken enough. The paramedics were called, and as they carried her out, they had no idea what kind of monster they were saving. She was rushed to the hospital, her body fighting the overdose, and while she lay in a hospital bed, recovering, the world outside was learning about what she had done. The media erupted. The entire country was in shock. A crime like this, the brutal, calculated butchering of a man, was unheard of in Australian history. The public wanted justice, and this time, Katherine Knight wasn't walking free. Katherine Knight was awake, alive, and now facing the full weight of her crimes. No theatrics, no resistance, just cold, emotionless silence. For months, investigators worked through the nightmarish details of her crime. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no question that she had done it. But the real question was, would she try to avoid responsibility? Would she try to claim insanity? As her trial approached, legal experts expected her to fight the charges, maybe plead insanity, maybe blame John, maybe try to spin the narrative like she had always done in her past relationships. But then something unexpected happened. Katherine Knight pleaded guilty. She didn't fight it. She didn't try to claim she wasn't responsible, didn't try to convince anyone she wasn't in control of her actions that night, because she knew there was no escaping this. For the first time in her life, her violence had finally caught up with her, and when the sentence was handed down, it was a punishment as rare as the crime itself. Life in prison. No parole. Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australian history to ever receive a life sentence without the possibility of release. She was escorted from the courtroom, showing no remorse, no emotion. She had won for years, manipulated, controlled, abused, and terrorized every man in her life. But this time, she had lost, and the world was safer without her. Katherine Knight never shed a tear for what she did. Not in court, not in prison, not in the years that followed. While the world struggled to comprehend the depths of her depravity, she never once apologized, never explained, never showed an ounce of regret. To this day, she sits behind bars, locked away forever in Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre, one of Australia's most notorious prisons. She will never be free again. No parole hearings, no second chances. For the first time in her life, she lost all control. And yet, even in a prison cell, she remains as cold and unrepentant as the day she was arrested. When asked about her crime, she refuses to talk about it. Some say she blocks it out, a coping mechanism for the horror she created. Others say she enjoys knowing that people still fear her name. But one thing is certain: Katherine Knight will die in prison, and she will never answer for what she did. But one question still lingers. Why? Why did she do it? Was this planned, or did something finally snap inside her that night? She had been violent before, jealous, controlling, sadistic, but this was something else. This was beyond murder. She didn't just kill John Price. She skinned him, cooked him, set the table to serve his remains to his children. This wasn't just about rage. This was about power. But what pushed her over the edge? What made that night different from all the others? And perhaps the most terrifying question of all: was John Price truly her first intended victim? Or just the first one who couldn't escape? What drives a person to such depravity? Was Katherine Knight always a monster born without empathy, without a conscience? Or was she made into one, the result of a brutal childhood, a lifetime of unchecked violence, and a mind slowly unraveling? Forensic psychologists have studied her case for years, searching for answers. Some believe she suffered from severe personality disorders, borderline personality disorder, psychopathy, or extreme narcissism. Others argue she was fully aware of her actions, that she simply enjoyed the control, the suffering, the horror. But in the end, no one can say for sure. All we know is this: Katherine Knight will go down in history as one of the most depraved killers Australia has ever seen. And her crime? It still haunts those who remember it. The human flesh cookbook killer, a name burned into Australia's darkest history. A woman who didn't just kill her victim, she butchered him like livestock. And the chilling question remains, was John Price her first intended victim? Or was he just the first one who couldn't escape?